What's up, everybody? You're listening to Lo-Fi Faith with Mike and James.
We're two guys who also happen to be pastors, doing our best to have open conversations about what it means to follow Jesus in today's world. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Lo-Fi Faith. I'm Mike, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, this absolute larrikin, James.
Hey! What's a larrikin?
I don't actually know, but it does suit this context.
Is that a thing?
It's a thing, yeah.
Or did you just make that word up out of thin air?
Usually a larrikin would be like someone who's a bit of a character. You'd say, oh, he's a bit of a larrikin, right? So I think you fit that description,
A
James.
larrikin, I'm Googling this, is an Australian English term for a mischievous, rowdy, but good-hearted person.
Oh, well, there you go.
You know what? That is me.
Yeah, see,
I'm a larrikin.
And here's the thing. I actually meant it as an insult, but it's a compliment. James, how's the body feeling after the tournament that just took place down in Dunedin over the weekend?
Yeah, the tournament was good. My body feels great. I could run it back. We put together ourselves an exhibition team filled with pastors and principals and conference leaders from both the North and South Island, and we took the tournament by storm. Nobody thought we could do anything, Mike. Nobody thought. They thought we were there for fun and for laughs, and what happened?
Well, we came to compete.
We came to compete.
We took it deadly serious.
Yeah, we did.
And
Far too serious.
Far too serious. It actually got awkward.
Yeah.
Well, I was okay with that, but... yeah, a lot of people weren't.
No. Well, actually, so the truth is we were never going to make the playoffs, but I guess the other teams weren't really fully aware of that. But they didn't think we would be good enough until we started winning. And when we started winning, all of a sudden the admin table started getting panicked requests about the rules and about whether or not this team is following them and whether or not we can make the playoffs. So I think we actually had everybody scared there.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine if you've put a team into a tournament, it would be a bit embarrassing to get kicked out of the playoffs by a group of pastors. So nobody really wants that. Nobody really wants that.
And they thought we would be a bunch of chickens just, running away from adversity. But turns out we had what it took.
Yeah. No, we were pretty athletic, and
well,
well, I mean, that's relatively speaking.
Yeah.
Relative to very unathletic people.
Yeah, compared to non-athletic people.
Compared to people who don't have the function of their arms and legs. We were quite athletic. And compared to people who've never picked up a basketball, we were near the level of NBA players.
Comparatively speaking.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it was a great time. We were able to play against all of the teams and get some cardio in. You scored a few buckets, I guess. I averaged a cool 2.3 points per game, which is right where I want to be. That's my sweet spot. Had a great time.
Love that assessment of my play. You scored a few buckets, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose I could admit that there were times when you shot the ball and it went through.
There was a moment or two when I put the ball in the hoop.
I can't recall all of them.
Yeah.
But
because there were so many, that's probably why.
Interpretations and perspective, But I do want to give a shout out to the Rolleston Bricks who took home the trophy. Well done and congratulations to them. On a side note, totally unrelated, we were the only team, I think, to give them a loss in the entire tournament.
Yeah, not related. Definitely not related.
But respect to, game recognizes game, and they came out and they played their hardest, and they did what they do. So we had a good time, good tournament. Looking forward to volleyball later in the year. Follow Lo-Fi Faith with Mike and James on Instagram to keep up with new episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and to join in on the conversation.
James, we're going to get into our conversation for today, and it's on the topic of worship. I remember when I was early on in my church-going days, I had a friend who's a good guy. He told me that the church building was actually constructed after the Old Testament sanctuary or temple. And he explained that the foyer area, when you walk in, is like the courtyard of the temple.
Oh, really?
Yep. Where the pews are, where people sit, is like the holy place.
Okay.
And then where the preacher stands, the pulpit or the rostrum area, is like the most holy place. And so he made that whole comparison to basically suggest that the way that the ancient Jews conducted themselves in and around the temple is the same way that we should behave when we go to our local churches.
So we should slaughter a lamb.
Well, yes, there are some inconsistencies there.
Okay.
It's not a one-to-one comparison, but in terms of what it would often come down to would be like this idea of reverence, right? So we need to be very reverent because God's presence is supposedly situated at the local church building. And so when we come into the building, we're also coming into God's presence. And that has a number of behavioral implications, mostly along the lines of reverence and how you define reverence and what that looks like.
So, and what was the conclusion? What were they actually trying to tell you? They're saying, okay, this is based on this design, and that means we should be reverent, and therefore, what?
Therefore, well, like I said, there were a number of implications. One was the way that we dress, right? Like the Old Testament priests, for example, they had a very specific type of dress, a way that they would dress for the temple and their priestly robes. And so therefore we should also wear
robes.
Not necessarily robes,
okay,
but our best, right? Respectful clothing. And again, it's a very broad category, but people would have their own ideas about that. Another implication, this is one that I've come across a lot, was the idea of reverence. And what this usually tended to result in was when we come to church and when we sit in the church in particular, we need to be silent. We need to be verbally silent. Like, don't speak, don't talk, because that is a way of showing respect to the presence of God, which you are in proximity to.
Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there. And it sounds like what you're saying here is that may not be the conclusion you're currently at.
No.
All right. Well, that was easy.
All right. Thank you guys for listening.
Yeah, have a good night, everybody. Yeah. Okay. So there was the idea of behaviorally we need to be silent because silent equals reverence because of the Old Testament view of the sanctuary. And then also that because the priests wore robes, we should wear our best clothing.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a lot actually to unpack in all of that, but I think ultimately a lot of it comes down to that first question. Okay, is the church actually modeled after the Old Testament sanctuary?
And does it function in the same way, or at least in some similar ways?
Right.
With like being the house of God, the place where His presence is kind of situated and located in some kind of permanent sense, because that's really what these ideas are banking on.
Right. And so, and all of that, of course, then leads to this idea that if this were true, therefore reverence would mean silence and dressing up in church. Okay, so tell me why you disagree with that at this point.
Right. Well, mostly because of Scripture.
Oh, well, when you go like that, yeah.
So, yeah, certainly when you read the Old Testament, there's a very particular setup when it comes to worship. I mean, you read through books like Leviticus, there are a lot of stipulations, a lot of regulations, a lot of laws, a lot of rules around how the Jews were to worship, how they were to approach God. There were, a lot of consequences if they got it wrong. So there was a lot of specificity there. But when we come to the New Testament, we see a different model, right? We don't see that the Christian church in the book of Acts and beyond were centering their worship around a particular structure, right? Like a temple or a sanctuary.
Right. It was no longer based on a physical space.
That's right.
Right. And we can even see this literally, right, as Jesus died on the cross. What happened?
The veil of the temple
right?
Was ripped.
So the separation between the holy place and the most
holy place,
where only once a year could the high priest go behind that curtain.
That's right.
Into the most holy place, into the presence of God for the very purpose of cleansing the sanctuary.
Yeah, it's a very restrictive place, a closed-off place.
Right.
Access was not open to everybody.
And that veil, that curtain,
was torn in two from top to bottom.
From top to bottom, which has implications, especially because, well, that would be difficult for a human to do.
Absolutely.
Among many other reasons, right? So we get this actual physical indicator, right? That the separation between this presence of God, the most holy place, and then where the people are, where the priests are serving, that's actually no longer there, right? Okay. So even when we look at this in the New Testament, the temple itself was changed at Jesus' death.
Yeah, there are indications that the temple was basically a more kind of temporary teaching concept, right? It was there to illustrate principles. It was there for the purposes of worship and these other kinds of things. But ultimately, it pointed towards a different reality, a greater reality,
Right.
that was brought into fulfillment through the death of Christ.
And we call this like the type and the antitype, right?
Yeah.
Which is the big theological language, which just is weird words for saying the shadow of something, right? The foreshadowing of something, and then the reality of something.
The substance of that thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're making the argument that I agree with, that the Old Testament temple was something that was meant to be a physical lesson to people, that once the lesson had been learned, which is when we get to the New Testament, no longer serves the same function. Okay, so then if that's true, then if we try to model our church's physical structures after that, we're trying to replace a lesson that's not actually about the physical space at all.
Yeah, well, it's almost like we're living in the prior age. It's almost like we're living in the time before Jesus came, and we're trying to take a lot of those principles and make them relevant for now, when it seems like the New Testament takes us on a different trajectory. Right. So I would hope that we would want to go on the trajectory. That's a difficult word to say, of the New Testament, rather than being stuck in practices and behaviors that served a purpose for a time, but have now been made somewhat obsolete by the revelation of Christ.
Well, beyond that also, right? Like, we don't actually treat our churches at all like the Old Testament temple in any way. There is no slaughtering of animals. There's no sprinkling of blood. There's no table of showbread. All of these things we recognize were types. They were foreshadowing something that Christ was fulfilling.
Yeah.
But I think we get hung up on the fact that we use the word sanctuary
Yeah, we do.
for this particular room in the church. And so because it's called the sanctuary, and the Old Testament called that the sanctuary, they must serve the same purpose, which is kind of to me like saying, okay, well, there's the sauna where you go and you sit and, you sweat out your toxins. But then I take my dining room and I call it a sauna, and that's where I eat. But because I call it a sauna, it's now serving the same function as the sauna.
Yeah, it's a false equivalence. And as you pointed out, it's impossible to be fully consistent with this because there are so many obvious differences. But there are also differences even in the way that I have seen it taught versus how it's practiced. For example, one particular church I was at was very strong on this. They're very strong on the idea that the sanctuary, quote unquote, which in other words, where the people sit in the church, where the pew area is, that was a place that if you were there, you had to be very silent. And this was policed in some sense. Like deacons and elders were trained to go around and tap people on the shoulders and hush them if they were talking. Even if it was something like somebody new had sat beside you and you were introducing yourself to them, that was also a no-no. But I remember in that same church, after people would leave, after the sermon had been preached and everything had been concluded, people would file out and go to lunch or whatever they would do. I would walk past the church, the sanctuary, and I would see an elder and another elder in there having a conversation, having some kind of meeting. So it was almost like, for most people, you're not allowed to speak in the church and during this particular time because God's presence is there and you need to be reverent. But then an hour later, now it's okay to go in there and have a big full-on conversation.
Right, it's fine.
It's not really consistent.
Which is why there are some people who want to be so consistent and say that room can only be used for this and you should always be quiet there at all times and it can't be used for any other purpose.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that comes from this idea that the sanctuary is where the presence of God is, right? Or the sanctuary is extra holy. So that leads me to, I think, a follow-up thought process, which is, well, okay, what actually, according to the Bible, if we're going to try to follow the biblical ideas through, what makes something holy? What makes a place or a person holy?
Yeah, the answer I would give to that would be God's presence, right? And a couple of examples you could give would be the temple itself, right? Because there is a sort of increasing level of holiness as you would walk through the sanctuary. You go from the courtyard, okay, there's some kind of holiness there, to the holy place, obviously it's a holy place, and then to the most holy place, which was seen to be the place where God would physically manifest his presence in some way. Another example would be when Moses encountered God at the burning bush, and he said, take your sandals off, for the place you're standing on is holy ground. Why was it holy? Was it just a random patch of holy ground that Moses happened to stumble upon? Or was it because of the proximity of God's presence?
Right.
That seems to be the conclusion.
Right. Yeah. I think that is really key to this whole discussion, right? So when Moses was there and all of a sudden that ground was holy, it wasn't because this is the one spot where physically heaven meets earth, right? And whenever we do that, that's why we have shrines and certain, religious settings and stuff, because they believe that ground itself is somehow more consecrated, more special, more holy.
Than another patch of ground.
Patch of ground. But according to what we see in the New Testament in particular, but even in the Old Testament, what made that place holy wasn't the bush, it wasn't the physical space, it was that God was there present in that moment with Moses. And as soon as God's presence moved on from that holy bush, the bush was no longer special.
That's
right. It
right.
was the same as it always had been.
Yeah.
Right? So holiness is connected to the actual presence of God. Well, if that's the case, then the question is, in the New Testament, is there anything that indicates where the presence of God is now? And is it in our church structure? So that's two questions. The first one is, well, in the New Testament, where did people meet, and were those considered holy in the same way as the temple?
Yeah. I would say not really. So where people met, it was kind of a sort of a haphazard situation, right? The Christian church in the New Testament are kind of a somewhat persecuted group of believers who have come out of either Judaism or from some of the Gentile religions. And they are kind of just doing the best that they can do. And they're meeting in houses, right? They're meeting in, like Acts 16, it says Paul and his companions met beside a river where prayer was customarily made.
Right.
They meet in public halls, like in Acts 19. There are a bunch of different places they met. There was not a single place that they would meet. They would meet where they could. And there's no evidence that I can see that they would treat any of these places equivalent to the way that the Jews would treat the Old Testament temple.
Or even as consecrated space.
Yeah.
It was special simply because they were together to worship God and to have their time with Him together in corporate fellowship. But it wasn't inherently special. That's why you could meet in someone's house. That's why you could meet in the public square, because you did not need a place to be set aside and consecrated to be holy.
Yeah.
What you needed was like an honest heart and an openness to worship God.
Basically, there seems to be a shift away from a focus in the Old Testament on sacred architecture, right, where there is this single place, this single structure that is the holy place because God's presence is seen to dwell there on some kind of permanent basis. There's a shift away from that in the New Testament.
Right. Yeah. So in the Old Testament sanctuary, like you said, they were very, very carefully prescribed. There was the length, the width, the girth, the height, everything was all prescribed to the detail because it was intended to teach an object lesson to those people. There's nothing prescribed like that in the New Testament because the presence of God is now shifted into a different place.
Yeah.
So I really think a powerful verse for this is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19, because it tells us that it says, "Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you received from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price." So this actually uses that same language, the temple of the Holy Spirit. So in the Old Testament, it was the actual temple.
Yeah.
In the New Testament, it's no longer that building. It is individuals who are connected to God. The Holy Spirit has now moved from this place where we have to go to God. God has now come to dwell within us.
Yeah.
So we actually take the holiness with us wherever we go.
Yeah, so it's a simple metaphor to describe the idea of God dwelling within us. And therefore, because God dwells within us, His people, those who worship Him, who trust in Him, who believe in Him, therefore we are holy. So, of course, yes, when God's people meet together, it is holy in the sense that God is dwelling within them, but they have the ability to meet wherever they want to. It's not dependent on a particular building or structure.
And thankfully that's true because there's so many places in the world where that's just not possible, right? You can't just go and meet in this perfectly designed rectangular meeting room.
Yeah. And my understanding is that Christians did not have churches in the traditional sense until the late 3rd early 4th century. I think
Yeah.
archaeologically that's the earliest finds that we have.
Essentially, what they did at that point, sorry to cut you off there.
It's okay, you usually do that.
I
I'm
often
used
do,
to it.
yeah. No, what they did is when they started melding Roman pagan religious practices with Christian practices, they took the Roman concept of the buildings and then they just sort of applied that and baptized it into Christian language. And so that's where we got this idea all over again. It didn't come from the Old Testament really at all at that point. We use that as justification, but really it came from a whole different religious practice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a passage that kind of hints at this is John 4, where Jesus is talking to the woman that he met at the well, fairly well-known passage. And
Well known.
and the woman asks him, well, she makes a statement. She says, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." So she's familiar with this theology, right? The holy place is Jerusalem, and you can boil it down all the way to the temple. And Jesus, in response, says this, "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Yet a time is coming, and it has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks." So Jesus seems to hint at a decentralization of worship here. It's not about a place, it's about worshiping in spirit and truth. It's about what's going on inside rather than the external circumstances in which you worship.
It's about the attitude of the heart
Yeah.
and the close connection that we have via the Holy Spirit, right, to the Father.
Yeah.
And so that then means that wherever we meet, that can take place, because what matters is more, are we spiritually connected, and are we being honest? Are we being true in our connection with God? And that can happen anywhere. That can happen in this studio in the same way that it can happen at a church sanctuary.
Yeah.
Just because we have that term sanctuary doesn't mean that place is more special than anywhere else.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we see these principles that Jesus is hinting at here, that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians and so on and so forth. I think that's what we see when we read the book of Acts and when we read other letters and books in the New Testament. We see early believers operating on those principles. They're not concerned with sacred architecture so much. They're concerned with worshiping in spirit and in truth. It's less about the place that you worship physically and more about the place spiritually, I could say, that you worship God in.
You're listening to Lo-Fi Faith with Mike and James.
So let's tie this all together. The so what? Like, what does this actually imply about, for example, how we use the space that we have? So we do have these churches. We have these physical buildings. We have this room. We call it the sanctuary. According to what we're saying here,
we should just trash those spaces.
we should just trash it, right?
That's the whole point I'm trying to make here.
Tear it all down.
No. Look, those places are still very valuable. It's great if you have a permanent place that you can come to every week to conduct your services, to run all kinds of programs. That's a real asset. It's a really valuable thing. So it should be treated with respect. Should it be treated akin to the Old Testament temple? And should we behave in all of the same ways? Well, clearly not, right? So there's some continuity. Let's treat the place with respect. There's also a lot of discontinuity. The Old Testament system, as we've already discussed, has basically faded away. It was a shadow. We have met the substance, which is Christ. So yes, we come to worship in these places, and we should respect them as valuable assets, but they are not the same thing as the Hebrew temple, where priests were the only ones who could really officiate, where sacrifices were made on a daily basis, where God's presence was kind of confined to in some sense. That's not the reality that we're living in New Testament, New Covenant times.
Right. So in other words, it's no longer about this specialist who has special access to God, and we just come there and watch them passively as they participate in getting closer to God.
Well, you say that it shouldn't be that way. It does tend to often be that way.
No, but we're talking about the implications of the theology.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So because of this, the real implication is that we're all actually supposed to be actively participating in our worship gatherings, in our fellowships, in our community, that it doesn't have to be limited to one space. It's wherever we go, wherever we gather, however we do it. And also for that particular building, I think this is good because it frees up that space. So now it can be used for worship, respectful worship. Like we want to be respectful as we come together. But the rest of the week, we have 6 more days where that space could be used for
all kinds of things,
all kinds of beneficial ways to help the community, to help other people, to teach, to train, to grow, to give space for kids to do something. And if we're not so tied down to this idea that it is a sacred space that can only be used in one way, all of a sudden the building can be used, I think, much more for God's glory because it's actually going to help people more often instead of just one day a week.
Absolutely. I also think, we mentioned reverence at the beginning of this episode. We need to wrap up soon. But, particularly Jesus' comments in John 4, that the Father is looking for those who worship in spirit and in truth. I think, again, that shies away from a lot of the externals that we tend to become focused on. And it raises the question, okay, what is true reverence? Is true reverence coming to church and being verbally silent while internally I could not be less interested in what's going on?
Yeah.
Like the example I gave of the church that I've been a part of, where like even if somebody new sits next to you and you're just being polite and introducing yourself, that's still a no-no. For me personally, I think that's far more reverent of making someone new feel comfortable in this new space they're in,
right,
than zipping it and going, I'll talk to you later in the foyer.
Yeah, it's kind of, we focus on the wrong things, right? Like if you set the wrong boundary, then it doesn't help. Like if you said that, the person in my life who matters to me is someone who is present, right? Well, if all you say is that they're present, well, that could be someone who deeply loves you or a stalker, right? Because the criteria is a little bit too broad.
Yeah.
And in this way, we're saying it's actually a little too narrow. If your suggestion for reverence is simply silence, you're missing people's hearts. You're missing the purpose of coming together.
100%.
And it also doesn't stand up to how the New Testament did their services either,
definitely not.
which is a whole different conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So I think our time is just about up, and hopefully you guys have found this helpful. I'd encourage you to go and read some of those passages that we've mentioned, John chapter 4, really the entire book of 1 Corinthians. But yeah, I do think that sometimes we get a little bit too caught up in some Old Testament ideas when the New Testament is taking us on this journey where, worship is decentralized. It is reverent. It is something to be respected. It is based on the holiness of God, but it doesn't have to be tied to a particular structure, a particular building. It is about worshiping God in spirit and in truth. And it's an interesting discussion to talk about what does that look like? What does that mean?
Thanks for hanging out with us on Lo-Fi Faith. If something resonated with you today, we'd love it if you shared the show with a friend.
You can catch up on past episodes at plains.org.nz and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We'll be back with a fresh episode in 2 weeks.
See you then.